She was 24 years old, dying alone in a Montana blizzard, the snow up to her chin, her hands the color of slate. She had come 2,000 miles on the promise of a stranger, and now that stranger was nowhere, and she was going to die in the dark with a letter still folded against her chest. Then the moon went out. A shadow stepped between her and the sky. Buffalo robes, a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders so broad they cut the wind in half. A gloved hand pressed two warm fingers to her throat, and a voice that sounded like the mountain itself had decided to speak rumbled out of the dark. Not today, little bird, not on my mountain. Stay with me by the fire tonight, friend, because the storm wasn't the worst thing trying to kill her, and the giant who carried her in from the snow was carrying secrets of his own. The blizzard came down off the Bitterroot Peaks like something that had been waiting. It did not howl, it screamed, it tore through the high passes of Montana Territory in the last week of December 1882 with a voice that sounded almost human, almost like grief, almost like a woman crying for something she had lost a long time ago and could never find again. The snow was not falling, the snow was being thrown sideways, horizontal, a wall of white that erased the world. And somewhere inside that wall, a young woman was dying. Cordelia Ashcroft did not know she was dying. That was the cruel part. Her body had stopped shivering an hour ago, and the cold that had bitten through her thin wool traveling coat had stopped feeling like cold at all. Now it felt like warmth, a slow, sweet, treacherous warmth that crept up her arms and legs and whispered into her chest that she should rest, just for a moment. Just close your eyes, Della. Just lay back in the snow and rest. Her father had warned her about this once in another life in a parlor in Boston with a fire going and the smell of pipe tobacco in the air. He had been a doctor. He had told her about men found frozen in the Massachusetts hills who had taken off their coats before they died, who had unbuttoned their shirts because they thought they were burning. The body lies to you at the end, Della, he had said. The body tells you sweet stories, so you will go quiet. She was 24 years old. She had honey blonde hair that had come loose from its pins and was now frozen against her cheek in pale ribbons. She had cornflower blue eyes that were having trouble staying open. She had a small carpet bag clutched against her chest with hands that had turned the color of slate. And she had a letter inside that carpet bag, a letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft, a letter that had promised her a home. The letter had lied. The letter had said a man named Silas Thorne would meet her at Miller's Crossing. The letter had said the journey from town up to the homestead in the Bitterroot Valley was a half-day's ride in good weather. The letter had not said the stagecoach driver would refuse to go past the last way station because of the storm. The letter had not said she would have to hire a wagon from a half-drunk teamster who took her money and turned back 2 hours up the trail. The letter had not said her hired horse would spook at a cougar's scream and bolt sideways off a mountain road that was no road at all but a deer trace. The letter had not said the wagon would crack apart against a granite boulder and send her tumbling down a slope into a drift of snow so deep it swallowed her like a grave. She had crawled. She remembered crawling. She remembered finding the broken wagon, finding the dead horse with its neck twisted at the wrong angle, finding her carpet bag flung clear by the impact. She had crawled toward the only shelter she could see, a rock outcrop maybe 20 yards away, and somewhere in those 20 yards her body had decided it had crawled enough. She was sitting now, half buried, her back against the granite. The snow was at her chin. She could feel her eyes wanting to close. Then the moon went out. That was how she experienced it. The faint silver light that had been showing through the storm simply went away, eclipsed by something larger than a man had any right to be. A shadow had stepped between her and the sky. She tried to lift her head. Her neck would not work properly. She managed only a small motion enough to see the silhouette of a figure who seemed carved out of the storm itself. Buffalo robes, a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders so broad they cut the wind in half before it reached her, and in one gloved hand a lantern that swung gently and threw a low yellow light across her dying face. He knelt. She felt him kneel more than she saw it. The snow shifted. A weight came down beside her. Then a glove was peeled back and two fingers, warm fingers, hot fingers, pressed gently against the side of her throat where her pulse was supposed to be. A long pause. Then a voice. The voice did not sound like a voice. It sounded like the mountain itself had decided to speak. Low, slow, steady. A rumble that came from somewhere deeper than a chest. Not today, little bird, not on my mountain. She felt herself being lifted. The buffalo robe came around her like a closing door. She tried to say something. She tried to say her name or thank you or please, but her tongue had gone numb in her mouth, and what came out was nothing at all. The last thing she registered before the dark took her was the smell of him. Pine resin, wood smoke, leather, and underneath those, something older, something earthy, something like the long memory of stone. Welcome to Frontier Rescue Stories. Before we ride any further into this winter, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button if you are new here. Drop a like if these tales mean something to you, and tell me down in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I love knowing what corner of the world is sitting by my fire. Now, let me tell you how Cordelia Ashcroft came to be dying in a Montana snowdrift in the last week of December 1882, because the storm was not the beginning of her trouble. The storm was only the last in a long line of things that had tried to kill her. To understand the woman in the snow, you have to go back to a doctor's parlor in Boston 4 months earlier, to a stairway, and to a man named Cyrus Pemberton. Edmund Ashcroft had been a good doctor and a poor businessman, which in the city of Boston in 1880 was very nearly the same thing. He treated the families of dock workers and lamplighters and the Irish women who washed laundry along the river. He charged what they could pay, which was usually nothing, and when they could not pay, he wrote it down in a ledger and forgot about it. Della had grown up watching him come home with his coat smelling of carbolic and his pockets empty and his eyes shining with the only currency he ever cared about, which was the gratitude of poor people. Her mother Vivian had loved him completely for this. Her mother had also died of typhus when Della was 10 years old, contracted from one of those same dock families, and Edmund Ashcroft had buried his wife and never married again and given the rest of his life to the work. He had needed money to buy quinine for the malaria cases that came up the river in summer. He had needed money for the diphtheria antitoxin. He had needed money for surgical instruments and chloroform and bandages and rent on the little clinic he kept above the apothecary on Beecham Street. And in 1877, when he had gone hat in hand to every bank in Boston and been turned away because the poor were not collateral, a man had come to him with an offer. The man's name was Cyrus Pemberton. He was 50 years old at the time, broad and heavy, with a face like a piece of polished beef and small, pale eyes that did not blink as often as a man's eyes ought to blink. He owned cattle, a great deal of cattle. He had built his fortune driving herds out of Texas after the war and selling beef to the Union Pacific work camps, and now he was buying ranches across western Massachusetts and into New Hampshire and dreaming, he said, of an empire that would feed the whole Northeast. He wore broadcloth suits cut by London tailors. He kept a townhouse on Beacon Hill, and he liked, he said, to be known as a friend of the working poor. He had loaned Edmund Ashcroft $3,000 at 5% interest. He had clapped the doctor on the shoulder and said the world needed more men like him. And for 3 years, he had let the loan sit, accruing nothing more than what was on the original papers. And he had attended Edmund's clinic openings and Edmund's charitable suppers and Edmund's lectures on public sanitation. And he had smiled at Edmund's daughter, Della, whenever he saw her, and his pale eyes had lingered on her in a way that made her father stand up a little straighter and steer her out of the room. Edmund Ashcroft died of a heart attack in February of 1880. He died in his clinic between patients at the age of 54. Della was 22. She had been working as a governess in the home of a Beacon Hill family for 2 years, by then teaching French and piano to 2 little girls she loved, and she had been planning to move home to keep house for her father. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By the following Tuesday, Cyrus Pemberton was in the parlor of her father's house with a leather portfolio under his arm and a smile that did not reach his pale eyes. The papers he laid on the table showed a debt of $3,000 at compound interest calculated at 12% annually. The papers he laid on the table also showed a second loan dated 1879 for $2,000 more. Della had never heard of any second loan. She said so. Pemberton smiled and tapped his finger gently on her father's signature. A man's signature is a man's signature, Miss Ashcroft. I am sure you would not wish to suggest your father was in the habit of signing things he did not understand. She had stared at that signature for a long time. It looked like her father's. It almost certainly was not. Her father had been meticulous about money even when he had none, and he would have told her about a second loan, but she had no way to prove it. The witness on the second loan was a clerk named Hollis Croom, who had been in Pemberton's employ for many years and who had subsequently conveniently drowned in the Charles River one cold March night. The total Pemberton claimed she owed him, including interest and penalties, and the funeral expenses he had generously covered, came to $7,400. It was a sum she could not have raised in 20 years of governess wages. Pemberton sipped his tea and looked at her over the rim of his cup. There is, of course, another way to settle this, he said. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years earlier. The official story was a fall down the back stairs of the Beacon Hill townhouse late one night while the staff slept. There had been bruises on her arms, the maid had said quietly, that did not match a fall. There had been a great deal of money paid to the maid afterward, and the maid had moved to Albany. The story in polite Boston society was that poor Cyrus had been so devoted to dear Margaret that he could hardly bear to speak her name. He spoke her name now. He said Margaret had been the great love of his life. He said no woman could ever replace her. But he said also that a man of his standing required a wife, someone discreet, someone refined, someone who understood obligation. He said he had watched Della grow up. He said he had been perhaps less than circumspect in his admiration. He said the debt could be considered settled on the day she became Mrs. Cyrus Pemberton. She had said no. She had said it 3 times in 3 different ways, each one more polite than the last, and on the third he had set his teacup down very gently and said, "One more thing. There is a debtor's hostel on Kearney Street, Miss Ashcroft. They take women who cannot pay. The conditions are not what a refined young woman is accustomed to. I would hate to see you there. I would hate to see your father's reputation become a matter of public record." She had asked him to leave. He had left. He had also left the papers on the table. That night, Cordelia Ashcroft had sat by the fire with the papers in her lap, and she had thought about her mother who had died because she would not stop tending the sick. She had thought about her father who had died because he would not stop helping the poor. She had thought about the small, frightened look that had come into Margaret Pemberton's face in the months before she fell down those stairs. And she had thought about a thing she had seen one Sunday in October at the back of the Globe newspaper, in the section where men advertised for laborers and women advertised for domestic positions, where there had been a small notice in plain print. Wanted wife, strong woman needed for Mountain Homestead, Bitterroot Valley, Montana territory, hard life, fair man, no drinkers, no idlers, no city ways. Letters, care of the Postmaster Miller's Crossing, Montana, to Silas Thorne. She had read that notice 3 times that Sunday, and she had laughed at it in the way a Boston girl laughs at the idea of a mountain, and she had turned the page. She had not known then that she would come back to it. She had not known then that she would tear it from the newspaper at the Beacon Hill Library 4 months later and fold it into the cover of her Bible and write a letter that very night. She wrote the letter at 2 in the morning by the light of one candle. She wrote it without crying because she had decided that she was finished crying. She told the truth as best she could without telling all of it. She said she was 23 years old. She said her father had been a doctor and was dead. She said she had been a governess and could read and write and cipher and sew and play the piano, none of which would matter on a mountain. But she said it anyway because she did not know what else to say. She said she was healthy. She said she was not afraid of work. She said she could not pay for her own passage and would understand if that disqualified her. She said she would expect to be treated with respect and would offer the same. She did not say what she was running from. She signed the letter Cordelia Ashcroft, and she walked it to the post office before sunrise, and she paid the postage with the last 6 cents in her purse. The reply came in 7 weeks. It came in a small, thin envelope with the postmark of Miller's Crossing, Montana territory. The handwriting on the outside was careful, slow, the hand of a man who did not write often and who had been taught to make his letters by a mother who insisted on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It said this: "Miss Ashcroft, your letter found me. I am 33 years old. I am a homesteader in the Bitterroot. I have a cabin and land and stock. I am not a handsome man. I do not speak much. I will never be a man for poetry. But I keep my word. You will have shelter. You will have food. You will never be afraid of me. I cannot pay your passage, but I will not leave you alone if you come. The journey is by train to Helena, and then by stage to Miller's Crossing. Write back if you wish to come. If you do not, I will understand. Yours, Silas Thorne." She had read the letter standing on the steps of the Beacon Hill post office. She had read it twice. Then she had walked 3 blocks to a tea shop and sat at a small table in the back and read it 11 more times. By the time the lamps were lit on the street outside, she had decided. She wrote back the same evening. She wrote that she would come. She wrote that she had a few small possessions, a Bible, some books, a brooch of her mother's. She wrote that she could leave in October. She did not tell him about Cyrus Pemberton. The letters went back and forth across the long miles of plain and prairie and mountain for the rest of that summer. He wrote to her about the homestead, about the way the aspens turned gold along the creek in September, about a heifer that had calved twins. He wrote that he had 2 younger brothers who lived on the place. He did not, in any of those letters, tell her much about his brothers. He wrote her short paragraphs that always ended with the same line: "I will not lie to you about the life. It is hard." but it is honest. Yours, Silas. She wrote to him about Boston, about the Charles in the Rain, about the Irish dock children she sometimes brought sweets to. She did not tell him she was selling everything she owned piece by piece to fund her ticket. She did not tell him she had come home one evening to find Cyrus Pemberton seated in her parlor with a glass of her father's brandy in his hand, saying that he had grown impatient, that he had given her time enough to think that the wedding would be in November or the hostel would be in November, and the choice was hers, but his patience was at an end. She did not tell him that she had nodded politely and smiled and seen Pemberton out, and then gone upstairs and packed everything she could carry into one carpet bag and a small trunk, and sent the trunk to the freight office that very night to be shipped ahead to Helena, Montana territory, marked General Delivery Hold for pickup. She did not tell Silas Thorne on her last letter that she had stolen one item from Cyrus Pemberton's coat that final evening when he hung it on the rack in her father's hall, a small silver derringer, a two-shot pocket pistol. She had taken it because she knew, walking out of that house with her bag in her hand at 4 o'clock in the morning, that she might need to put a bullet through Cyrus Pemberton's chest someday, and she did not intend to do it with a knife. She did not tell Silas any of that. She told him only that she was coming. She told him she would arrive at Miller's Crossing on the 22nd of December. She told him she was not afraid. She had been afraid the entire way. The train to Helena took 8 days. The stage to Miller's Crossing took 3 more. By the time the stagecoach driver pulled up at the way station and refused to go further into the storm, Della had lived on cold biscuits and weak coffee for nearly 2 weeks, and the inside of her chest felt scoured by exhaustion and dread. She had hired the teamster with the wagon because she had promised Silas she would arrive on the 22nd, and because she could not bear, after 24 days of running, to spend another night sleeping on a bench in a way station with strangers watching her in their sleep. The teamster had been drunk. The teamster had turned back. The horse had bolted. The wagon had crashed. And now she was being carried through a screaming blizzard by a man whose face she had not seen, whose voice she had heard only once, who had pressed his fingers to her throat and decided she was worth saving. She drifted in and out. The cold did not feel like cold anymore. It felt like the absence of everything. She was aware distantly of motion, of the great long stride of the man who carried her. She was aware that her cheek was pressed against fur, against something that smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, against the hard, slow beating of a heart larger than any heart she had ever been close to. She was aware that the wind was screaming, and yet she could not feel it on her face anymore because his body was between her and the wind. She thought very dimly that she had never been carried by a man in her life. Her father had carried her once when she was very small after a fever. No one since. She tried once to lift her head, to look at him. The lantern light caught the edge of a beard, dark and thick, frosted with ice, the edge of a strong jaw, nothing more. Then the dark closed over her again, and the carrying went on, and she thought, this is what dying feels like, being held by something larger than you, being taken somewhere you cannot see. She woke once briefly to the sound of a door slamming, to the sudden absence of the wind, to heat that hit her face like a hand. She tried to open her eyes. She managed only a slit. She saw firelight on log walls. She saw a man's hands, enormous, callous, the knuckles cracked from cold, working at the buttons of her coat. She heard his voice again, softer now, almost gentle. Forgive me, miss. The wet kills you faster than the cold. Then the dark came back, and this time it came with dreams. She dreamed of fire. She dreamed of her father standing in the parlor in Boston, smiling at her, saying her name. She dreamed of Cyrus Pemberton coming up a staircase, and she dreamed she was Margaret Pemberton on that staircase, and the stairs went down and down forever. She dreamed of a great voice, the voice from the snow, saying, not today, not today, not today. She dreamed of a hand the size of a shovel resting on her forehead, cool, calloused, gentle. She dreamed she leaned into that hand and begged it not to leave. She dreamed it stayed. She woke for real on the third day. The first thing she registered was the smell, wood smoke, roasting meat, something herbal sage maybe, or yarrow. The second thing she registered was warmth, real warmth, wool blankets piled on top of her, a fire crackling somewhere to her left. The third thing she registered was that she was wearing a man's flannel shirt that came down to her knees and absolutely nothing else, and that her own clothes were nowhere in sight. The fourth thing she registered was the voice, a different voice this time, younger, softer, reading aloud. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. She turned her head slowly because her neck still ached, and she opened her eyes. A man was sitting in a rocking chair beside the bed. He was holding a small leather-bound book in hands that looked too large for the book. He had dark blonde hair that fell past his collar in soft waves. He had warm, whiskey-colored eyes that had been on the page until her movement caught them. He had the build of his older brother, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, but there was a softness to his face that the man in the snow had not had. He was perhaps 27 years old. He looked in the firelight almost like a poem of a man. He saw her looking at him, and he closed the book very gently and laid it on the floor beside his chair, as if afraid the sound of it might startle her. "You're awake," he said. His voice was deep, but it had warmth in it the way a good cello has warmth. "Easy. Ma'am, don't try to sit up just yet. You've been out for 3 days." She opened her mouth. Her tongue was dry. He saw it before she could ask, and he reached for a tin cup on the small table beside the bed and held it to her lips. The water was clean and cold and tasted like the high country. She drank in small swallows. He took the cup away. "I'm Beauregard," he said. "Most folks call me Beau. I'm the youngest. There's 3 of us. My brother Silas brought you in." Her hand moved weakly against the blanket. She tried to remember the name and the letters. Silas Thorne, the man who had said he would never lie to her, the man who had carried her through the storm. She formed a question just barely with a voice that came out thin as a reed. 3. Beau Thorne nodded slowly. She saw a flicker of something across his face. Not deception, something more like an apology. 3 brothers, ma'am. Yes, Silas didn't write you about us, me and Rhett, that is. He wanted you to come for him, not for the rest. He thought it was more honest that way. Whether he was right about that, well, that's between him and you. But you should know we live here. All 3 of us. This is our place. She closed her eyes. She felt the room tilt very slightly. 3 men. She had come 2,000 miles to a cabin she had imagined as having 1 man in it, and now there were 3. Beau saw her face, and his voice came back even gentler. "Easy now. None of us mean you any harm. Silas was real clear with me and Rhett before you came. You're his bride if you choose to be, not ours. We're brothers, miss. We ain't bandits. You have my word on that." A door opened then somewhere in the cabin. Heavy boots crossed wood. 2 pairs, not 1. She heard the second pair stop in the doorway. The first pair kept coming. She turned her head again and looked for the first time in waking life at the man who had carried her in. He was the largest human being she had ever seen up close. 6.5 feet, at least, maybe more. Shoulders that filled a door frame, a chest like the side of a barn. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a leather vest and dark wool trousers and tall boots, and his hair was the color of dark chestnut and hung loose to his collar. His beard was a few weeks past trimmed. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to a fire. There were scars on his hands, and one along the line of his cheekbone, faded old. He did not look at her like a man who was glad to see her awake. He looked at her like a man who had been carrying a weight a long time and was not sure he could put it down. The second man in the doorway was a half step behind him, shorter by an inch, but not by much. Sandy blonde hair, whiskey eyes, a cocky tilt to his mouth that was half a smile and half a dare. This one was leaner than the first, built like a wolf. He was watching her with frank curiosity. The big man crossed the room and stopped at the foot of the bed. Beau rose from the rocking chair without being asked and moved aside. "Miss Ashcroft," the big man said. His voice was the voice from the snow. Lower in this room than it had been outside, but the same voice. The voice that had said, "Not today." She tried to answer. She managed a word. "Mr. Thorne." He nodded once. Then he stood looking at her for what felt like a long time, and his face did not change. She could not read him at all. She felt a flicker of something cold in her chest, an old fear, the parlor in Boston, Cyrus Pemberton staring at her over a teacup. She fought it down. She lifted her chin a fraction. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, just a small tightening. "You're alive," he said. "I wasn't sure." "I'm grateful," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "You saved my life. Anybody would have," he said. The man in the doorway laughed short and dry. That ain't true, and you know it, Cy. Half the men in this territory would have left her there to keep their own boots warm. Don't sell yourself." The big man's jaw tightened. He did not turn his head. "This is my brother Rhett," he said. "The middle one. He talks too much." Rhett Thorne grinned at her, a real grin, white teeth, in a sun-browned face. "Pleasure, ma'am. You took a hard fall. You're tougher than you look. I'll say that." She felt, despite herself, a small flare of warmth in her chest at the easy way he said it, as if she had passed some kind of test simply by living, as if living were a thing to be admired. Silas Thorne did not smile. He cleared his throat low, the sound of a man who had been thinking for 3 days about how to begin a conversation and had not yet figured it out. "Miss Ashcroft, there are things I owe you the saying of, I should have written you about my brothers. I did not. That's on me. There's also the matter of the arrangement. You came up here on the strength of a letter, and the letter was true so far as it went, but it didn't tell you everything. I aim to tell you everything now, if you're well enough to hear it." She nodded. She drew herself up against the pillow. The flannel shirt was loose around her shoulders. She gathered the blanket up to her collarbone with as much dignity as she could find. "Tell me," she said. He pulled the rocking chair around and sat. Even sitting, he was tall. He folded his great hands over his knees and looked at the floor between his boots and nodded her. "Bo and Red are my brothers," he said. "We were raised on this place. Our mother died when our sister Annalise was born. Bo was 9 then. I was 15. Rhett was 12. Our father died 2 years ago. Annalise herself died when she was 12. There's 4 graves on this mountain, and 3 of them belong to us. The fourth I dug for myself." Della felt her breath catch. "I was at war when our sister died," he said. He still did not look up. "I was with the 5th Cavalry under General Crook in the Wyoming Territory. I came home from that war a different man than I went out as. There are things I did up there that I will never make right. When I came back, my sister had been in the ground 2 weeks, and Bo and Rhett had buried her by themselves. I did not handle it well. For a long time, I did not handle anything well." Bo by the fire looked into the flames. Red in the doorway had stopped grinning. "I built that 4th grave the year my father died," Silas said. "I dug it because I thought I would be in it before long. I wanted to lie down with my family. That was my plan. I am telling you this because you came 2,000 miles on the word of a man who was, when he wrote that ad, only halfway sure he meant to be alive a year from then. You deserve to know who you wrote to." Della did not answer at first. She could not. He went on slowly. "I am not going to ask you to be my wife. Not tonight and not in the morning. You came up here to a situation I did not fully describe, and you nearly died doing it, and I will not have your gratitude mistaken for anything more than gratitude. Here is what I propose. You stay here through the winter. You take this room. I sleep in the barn loft. I will take the cot down to the barn tonight. The boys have their rooms in the loft above us. They will keep to themselves. We will feed you. We will keep you warm. You will not be touched. You will not be required to work past your strength. When the spring thaw opens the pass sometime in April, I will take you down to Helena myself, and I will give you enough money to start a life anywhere in this country you choose. If you wish to stay at that point, that is a different conversation. But the spring is the spring. Until then, you owe me nothing. We have an agreement." Della stared at him. He still had not looked up at her. She understood suddenly why he would not. He was afraid. This enormous man who had walked through a screaming blizzard to find her was sitting in front of her, afraid that she would say no, and afraid that she would say yes, and afraid that either way he would fail her. "Mr. Thorne," she said. He looked up. His eyes in the firelight were the color of dark honey, and there was a tiredness in them that was older than the war he had just spoken of. There was something else, too, something she did not have a word for yet. She would find the word later. The word, when she found it, would be hope. A small hope, fragile, half ashamed of itself, but hope. She swallowed. "Mr. Thorne," she said again, "I accept your terms. I will think about the rest through the winter. I cannot promise you more than that tonight." His shoulders moved just a little, a long-held breath easing out. "That's all I'm asking," he said. There was a long pause. The fire popped. Somewhere outside, the wind that had nearly killed her was still screaming through the high passes, but in here in the cabin, the screaming was very far away. Then she said the thing she had been afraid to say. "Mr. Thorne, I have not been entirely truthful with you either." He said nothing. He waited. "There is a man," she said, "a man in Boston. He believes I owe him a debt. He believes I owe him my hand in marriage. He is not a man who accepts losing what he has decided is his. I do not think he will follow me to Montana, but I cannot swear to you that he will not." She watched his face. His face did not change. The jaw tightened a fraction. That was all. "What is his name?" he said. "Cyrus Pemberton." A muscle moved in his cheek. "Cattle," she said. "He is in cattle. New England mostly. He has men who work for him. I should have written you about him before I came. I did not because I was afraid you would tell me not to come. I am sorry." He considered this for a long moment. Then he reached slowly across the small distance between them, and his great calloused hand settled very lightly on top of the blanket where her own hand was. Not on her hand. On the blanket above it. A weight. A presence. Nothing more. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I have buried more people than I would like to count on this mountain. I have made a habit since the war of not making promises I do not intend to keep. So hear me now. Whatever this man is, whatever he sends, whoever rides up the pass after you, he will not take you off this mountain, not while I am breathing. That is not an arrangement. That is a fact. Do you understand me?" She felt for the first time in 3 years something inside her chest let go. A knot she had been carrying so long she had forgotten she was carrying it. Her eyes filled up. She did not let the tears fall. She nodded once. "Yes," she said, "I understand you." He took his hand back. He stood. He was very tall in the small room. "Get some rest," he said. "There is stew on the fire. Bo will bring you some. Tomorrow we'll talk more." He turned to go. At the doorway, he paused, and without turning back, he spoke one more thing. A man keeps his word, Miss Ashcroft. That is the only thing I have left that I am sure of. You came 2,000 miles on my word. I will not make a liar of myself. Then he was gone, and Rhett gave her a small grave nod and followed him, and Bo lifted the lid of the iron pot over the fire, and the smell of elk stew filled the cabin like a blessing. Outside, the storm went on. Inside, on a narrow bed against a log wall in a borrowed flannel shirt, under a pile of wool blankets, with a poet of a man tending a fire on her left, and a giant of a man bedding down in a barn loft on her right, and a wolf of a man pacing the porch with a rifle, Cordelia Ashcroft closed her eyes and slept. The first real sleep she had slept since her father died. She did not know yet that Cyrus Pemberton had already sent 2 men west. She did not know yet that those 2 men had reached Helena 3 days behind her. She did not know yet that one of those men was carrying a tintype of her face and a poster offering $1,000 for her safe return to Boston and a second thousand for the death of any man who tried to keep her. She did not know yet that the worst winter of her life was not the storm she had survived. The worst winter of her life was the one she was about to spend in a small cabin in the Bitterroot Valley with 3 Thorne brothers, learning what it meant to be home, learning what it meant to be loved, and learning slowly, painfully, that some debts in this world cannot be settled by running. Some debts have to be answered. But that is a story for the next part of the night. For now, in the cabin, the fire popped. Bo Thorne, the youngest, the quiet one, the one with whiskey eyes and a Walt Whitman in his pocket, ladled stew into a wooden bowl. He carried it to the bed. He set it on the small table beside her. He did not look at her face for too long, because he was the kind of man who understood instinctively that a frightened woman in a strange bed deserved the gift of not being looked at. He turned to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "there is one more thing I think you should know tonight." She waited. When my brother carried you in, he said you were the first thing he carried into this house in 3 years that wasn't an animal he was bringing in to die. He sat by your bed for 2 days without sleeping. We had to make him eat. He kept saying you weren't going to make it. He kept saying it was his fault for letting you come up here in winter. Whatever he tells you about arrangements and contracts and giving you money in the spring, miss, you should know what I saw. I saw a man who has not let himself want anything in 3 years sit by a stranger's bed and pray. That is all I'm going to say. Good night, ma'am. He closed the door. Della lay in the firelight for a long time after that. She did not eat the stew right away. She lay with her hands folded on the blanket, and she stared at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, and she thought about the man in the snow and the man in the rocking chair who read poetry, and the man on the porch with the rifle, and the giant who had carried her and then been afraid to look at her, and the storm outside that was still screaming, and the long distance she had come, and the silver derringer in the bottom of her carpet bag, and the husband she had not yet decided whether to take, and the empty grave on the hillside, and the spring thaw still 4 months away. She thought, until the night I came here, I had until morning to decide whether to ride back to a life with nothing or stay in these mountains with men I did not know, and a promise I was not sure they could keep. Now I have until spring. She did not know what she would decide. She knew only that for the first time in her life, the deciding was hers. Outside the cabin, the wind tore at the eaves and tried to find a way in. It did not find one. The Thorne brothers had built that house with their own hands and built it well. The fire popped and settled. The stew cooled on the small table. And somewhere down in the dark of the barn, a giant of a man lay on a narrow cot in his coat with his rifle across his chest and listened to the storm and to his own heart, which was beating, for reasons he was not yet ready to name, more loudly than it had beaten in a long time. The longest winter of his life was just beginning, too. The morning after Cordelia Ashcroft slept her first real sleep in 3 years, she woke to the smell of coffee. The cabin was quiet. The storm outside had eased sometime in the night, and in its place was the deep silence of fresh snow. Through the small window beside the bed, she could see the pale blue light of a winter dawn. The fire in the hearth had been built up some time while she slept. Someone had come into the room quietly in the dark and placed another log on the flames and gone again without waking her. She thought of the great calloused hand that had rested on the blanket above her own the night before, and she did not have to wonder which brother it had been. She tried to sit up. Her ribs ached. Her left knee throbbed where it had struck something in the wagon crash, but the deeper pain, the cold that had been in her bones for 3 days, was finally gone. She managed to swing her legs over the side of the bed. She stood. She wavered. She caught herself on the bedpost. The flannel shirt she wore came down past her knees. Her own clothing was nowhere in the room, but a folded stack of garments had been laid on the chair by the fire. A wool dress, plain, dark gray, simple, the kind of dress a frontier woman would wear, a muslin shift, wool stockings, a pair of moccasins that were clearly too large for her but lined with rabbit fur. She understood looking at the clothes that someone had ridden somewhere or pulled them out of a chest or done something in the time she had been unconscious to make sure she had what she needed when she woke. She did not know yet which Thorn brother it had been. She suspected again the same one. She dressed slowly. The wool was rough but warm. She combed her hair as best she could with her fingers and pinned it loosely at the nape of her neck. She walked to the door of the small room and she opened it. The main room of the cabin opened in front of her like a held breath. It was larger than she had imagined from inside the bedroom. Heavy timbered beams, a long pine table with benches on either side, a river stone fireplace big enough to walk into, pelts on the walls, a pair of rifles on pegs above the door, and along the far wall a kitchen counter with a cast iron stove, and at that stove, his back to her, stood the giant. Silas Thorne was making breakfast. He was wearing only the flannel shirt and trousers, no coat or vest, and even so, the size of him in the space was something to reckon with. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. His forearms were heavy and corded and crossed with the pale tracery of old scars. He was turning bacon in a skillet with the careful attention a man pays to small tasks when he has been alone too long. He had not heard her open the door. She had a moment, just a moment, to look at him without his knowing. The light from the window caught the dark chestnut of his hair. The bend of his shoulders was not the bend of a tired man. It was the bend of a man who was concentrating hard on not turning around. He had heard her after all. She cleared her throat softly. He turned. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. He looked at her in the wool dress, and something passed across his face that she could not read and was gone before she could try. He nodded toward the table. "Sit down. Coffee's hot. Bacon's almost." She sat. He brought a tin mug to the table and set it in front of her. He did not pour the coffee himself, but left the pot on a trivet within her reach. She understood that this was a courtesy. He was not going to wait on her like a servant. He was also not going to make her get up and cross the room. He was finding on the spot the line between care and respect, and he was walking it carefully. The bacon came onto her plate next. Then biscuits, 3 of them golden brown, with a small crock of butter and another of honey. He set down a plate for himself across from her and sat. "Rhett is feeding the stock," he said. "Bo is up at the wood pile splitting kindling for the day. They'll be back by midday." She nodded. She picked up the biscuit. Her hand was steadier than she had expected. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He paused with his coffee halfway to his mouth. "Some," he said. She looked at his face. She saw the dark beneath his eyes that said he had not slept much at all. She did not press. They ate in silence for a while. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had died completely, and she could hear faintly the sound of Bo singing something low and tuneless out by the woodpile. Silas ate the way a man eats who has been a soldier, quickly, without ceremony, without waste. He finished before she was halfway through. He did not get up. He sat with his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and he looked at the table, not at her. "Mr. Thorne," she said. He looked up. "I have not thanked you properly." He shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks." "I think I do," she said. "I think I owe you a great many things, and I am going to start with the smallest one. Thank you for the dress." A faint flush moved up the side of his neck above the collar of his shirt. "That was Bo," he said. "He rode down to May O'Branigan's place at first light yesterday morning while you were sleeping. The O'Branigans run the dry goods at Miller's Crossing. May's about your size. She sent up 2 dresses and a shift and these moccasins. She also sent a note saying if you needed anything else to send word." Della smiled. It was a small smile, the first she had felt move across her face in a long time. "Then thank you to Bo and to May," and she added more quietly to whoever it was who came in last night and put a log on the fire. He was very still for a moment. Then he nodded once, and he did not deny it, and that was answer enough. The day moved slowly after that, and she liked it slow. She helped wash the breakfast dishes over his protest because she could not bear to sit and be waited on. She found the cabin to be on closer inspection, a place built by men who knew what they were doing. The chinking between the logs was tight. The shelves were level, the floors were swept. Bo, she would learn, was the one who kept the inside in order and tended the small artisan work, the mending and the carving and the quiet things. Rhett tended the stock and the trapping and ran the outdoor lines. Silas did everything else, and the things he did well. When the dishes were finished, she sat by the fire and she let him show her slowly the layout of the place. The pantry off the kitchen, the cellar door beneath the rug, the locked cabinet over the door where the powder and the long rifles were kept. The hooks by the entry where the heavy coats hung and which one was hers, now a smaller buffalo coat that had been their mother's, that had been folded in a chest for 13 years. She put her hand on the buffalo coat. The fur was dense and warm and smelled faintly of cedar. Your mother, she said. Margot, he said, from St. Louis. Beauchamp was her family name. She married my father in 1848. They came west in 50. Beau carries her family name as his given name, Beauregard. Same Beau, same root. She picked it before he was born. That is a beautiful name, Della said. She was a beautiful woman, he said. Then he turned away and busied himself with the wood box, and she understood that the conversation had ended. Beau came in for the noon meal with snow on his shoulders and his cheeks red from the cold. He saw her sitting at the table, and he stopped just inside the doorway, and his whole face changed. He had the kind of face she realized that hid nothing. Whatever he felt, his face said it before his mouth could. Miss Ashcroft, he said, you're up. She is up, Silas said from the stove. And she has eaten, and she has decided she is going to wash the lunch dishes too, whether I like it or not, so I would suggest you eat fast. Della laughed. It surprised her. It surprised both of them. It was a small laugh, but it was a real one, and it changed the air in the cabin in a way she could feel. Beau grinned and crossed to the table and folded his long body down onto the bench across from her. Up close in the daylight, he was even more striking than he had been in the firelight, the whiskey eyes, the dark blonde hair. There was a softness around his mouth that the older brother did not have at all. Silas was carved out of granite. Beau was carved out of something warmer. Rhett came in 20 minutes later, stamping snow off his boots with 2 snowshoe hairs slung over his shoulder and a smile that was already half a tease. Look at this, he said. Up out of bed and dressed proper and pouring her own coffee. Si, you owe me $1. I said she'd be on her feet by noon. I never took the bet, Silas said. I'm collecting anyway. Rhett swung the hairs onto a hook by the door and crossed to the table and sat down beside Beau. He looked at her frankly, openly, without the careful, averted gaze of the older brother or the gentle deference of the younger. He looked at her as if she were a problem he intended to solve by becoming her friend. How are you feeling? He said. Sore, she said. Grateful. Confused. Confused is fair, he said. I've been confused about my own brother my whole life. You'll get the hang of him. Silas at the stove said one short word that was not quite a curse. Rhett grinned and reached for the bread. The meal went easier than the breakfast had. Rhett was the one who carried the conversation, asking her questions about Boston, about the train, about the stagecoach, never about why she had come, never about the man whose name had been spoken last night. He had a gift for finding the small funny things in any story. By the end of the meal, he had her describing the drunk teamster who had abandoned her doing his accent, and Beau was laughing into his coffee, and even Silas had something in his eyes that was almost a smile. When the dishes were done and the fire was built up again, Silas stood and reached for his coat. I'm going up to the high meadow to check the cattle, he said. Storm will have driven them down into the timber. I'll be back before dark. Take Beau, Rhett said. I want to talk to Miss Ashcroft. Silas paused. He looked at Rhett. Rhett looked back, untroubled. It's all right, Della said. I'd like that. Silas studied his middle brother for another long second. Whatever was passing between them was not anger. It was more like the silent communication of men who had grown up together and could say a great deal without speaking. Whatever Rhett's eyes told him, Silas accepted it. He nodded once. Beau with me, he said, bring the long rifle. The two of them suited up and went out into the white noon, and the door closed behind them, and Della was alone with the middle brother for the first time. Rhett did not waste it. He sat down across from her at the table, and he folded his arms on the wood, and he looked at her, and the teasing in his face was gone now. What was left was something steadier and harder. Miss Ashcroft, he said, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a straight answer. All right, she said. Last night you told my brother there is a man in Boston who thinks he owns you. Yes. Cyrus Pemberton. Yes. How dangerous is he? Don't soften it. I need to know what's coming. She drew a breath. She told him. She told him about her father, about the loans, about the death of Margaret Pemberton on a back staircase, about the maid who had been paid off and moved to Albany. She told him about the $7,400, about the debtor's hostel, about the night Cyrus Pemberton had sat in her parlor with her father's brandy in his hand and told her she was running out of time. She told him about packing a carpet bag at 4 a.m. She told him about the trunk she had sent ahead to Helena, and then because he had asked her not to soften it, she told him the last thing. I took something from him on my way out, she said. What? She stood up, walked to the bedroom, opened her carpet bag at the foot of the bed, and brought back the small silver derringer. She set it on the table between them. The two barrels caught the firelight. A pocket pistol, she said, 2 shots. It was in his coat, which he hung on my father's coat rack the last time he came to the house. I took it because I had decided that if he sent men after me, I was not going to be the only one in the room with a weapon. Rhett looked at the pistol. He looked at her. Then he did something she did not expect. He picked up the derringer, broke it open, checked the load, snapped it closed, and slid it back across the table to her with a small, respectful nod. You loaded it correctly, he said. Most folks don't the first time. Where did you learn? My father, she said. He kept a revolver in his clinic. He showed me how when I turned 16. He said a doctor's daughter who lived alone above a bad neighborhood ought to know one end of a gun from the other. Your father said Rhett sounds like a man I would have liked. He was, she said. The middle brother sat back. He rubbed his jaw. He looked at the fire for a long moment. I'll tell you something now, Miss Ashcroft. Rhett Thorne does not speak for his older brother. Silas does that for himself, but I will tell you what I know about Silas, which is this. 6 years ago, he came home from a war he should never have fought in, and he found our sister dead. He spent 2 years trying to drink himself into the grave he dug for himself up on that hillside. Bo and I pulled him out of it. Took us 2 years. 6 months ago, he started writing letters to a woman in Boston. He didn't tell us about the letters at first. We figured it out from the postage and the trips down to the crossing. Whoever you are, whatever you wrote in those letters, you brought him back to himself in a way me and Bo couldn't. He read your last letter sitting on this porch in the rain in August, and he was smiling like I haven't seen him smile since before the war. Now you're here, and there is a man in Boston coming after you. I want you to understand something. We are not going to give you up, not because of any contract, because my brother smiled in the rain. Are you hearing me? She was hearing him. Her eyes were full. She nodded. He nodded back. He stood. I'm going to go split wood, he said. You stay by the fire. If Bo gets back before Cy, you tell him what you told me. If Cy gets back first, you tell him too. No more secrets in this house. Agreed, agreed, she said. He pulled on his coat and went out. She sat alone by the fire for a long time after that. The derringer lay on the table where she had set it. She did not put it away. She thought about Rhett's hands checking the loads, the casual matter-of-fact respect with which he had passed the weapon back. She thought about the words Bo had said the night before, about Silas sitting by her bed praying. She thought about a man smiling in the rain reading her letter. She thought for the first time in 3 years that maybe her father had not been wrong about the kind of men there were in the world. He had told her once that the good ones existed. They were just rare, he had said, and they did not announce themselves. You had to look. You had to be patient. She had not had to look. 3 of them had walked into her life in 24 hours. The afternoon slipped away. Rhett split wood out behind the cabin in steady, rhythmic strokes that she could hear through the walls. The light at the window turned from white to silver to the long gold of late afternoon. She made tea, found that they had real China tea in a tin, decided she would tell Bo later that whoever had thought to keep it for her was a kind person. She found a basket of mending in the corner, took out a pair of trousers with a torn knee, and sat by the fire and stitched. Silas and Bo came back at dusk with their coats white and their faces red and the smell of pine and cold on them. Silas saw her at the fire with the mending in her lap and stopped just inside the door. She watched his face. She saw for one unguarded second something hit him hard. He did not say what it was. He did not have to. She had imagined on the train a man coming home from work to a fire and a woman by it. She knew what such a picture had looked like in her own mind. She had not understood until that second that he had imagined the same picture and that he was seeing it now and not believing it. He set down the rifle and shook the snow off his coat and hung it up. He crossed to the fire. He looked at the trousers in her lap. Those are mine, he said. I know, she said. He sat down in the chair across from her without taking his eyes off the work in her hands. He watched her draw the needle through the wool. He did not speak for a long minute. She did not stop sewing. Outside, Rhett's axe had paused. The cabin was very quiet. Mr. Thorne, she said, without looking up. Yes. I told your brother Rhett everything this afternoon about the man, everything I did not tell you last night. He said no more secrets in this house. So now I am telling you also, in case he does not. The man's name is Cyrus Pemberton, and he is the kind of man who killed his first wife. I do not know that for a court of law. I know it the way a woman knows things. He has money and patience, and he believes I am his property. He will come. I do not know when, but he will come. And I took a pistol from him before I left, which is on the table there, and I would rather you all know I have it than discover it some night. She finished the seam. She tied it off. She raised her eyes. Silas was looking at her, not at the trousers, at her face. She had thought the first time she saw him in the bedroom that his eyes were the color of whiskey. She saw now that there was firelight in them and that the firelight made them gold. He did not blink. He did not look away. The silence between them was not awkward. It was something else, something she did not yet have a word for, the same way she had not had a word for what she had seen in his face the night before. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. His voice was lower than it had been all day. He stood up. "Supper," he said, "will be ready in an hour. Bo is making it. Rhett will be in soon. I am going to step out and check the perimeter one time before dark." He picked up the rifle on his way to the door. He stopped with one hand on the latch and he spoke without turning. "Miss Ashcroft." "Yes. If Cyrus Pemberton comes up this mountain, he is not going to find what he expects." "What is he going to find?" she asked very quietly. Silas Thorne stood with his hand on the latch and his back to her, and after a long breath he answered. "3 brothers," he said, "and a woman who took his gun." He went out. The week that followed was the week she began to learn the cabin, and the cabin began to learn her. She rose with the men before dawn because she found she could not bear to lie in bed listening to Bo build the fire. She helped him. She learned that cedar bark caught a spark faster than pine, and that you fed a morning fire with pencil-thin kindling first and only added the heavier wood when the small wood was glowing. She learned to make biscuits at altitude where the leavening worked differently. She learned to render the fat off a strip of bacon to grease a skillet. Bo taught her these things in his quiet way, never correcting her in front of his brothers, always finding a moment when they were alone in the kitchen to murmur a little less salt next time, or the lard goes in cold, Miss Never Warm. Rhett took her out behind the woodshed on the 3rd morning with a Colt revolver, the spare one, and he set up 4 tin cans on a stump. "Your derringer is for if a man is close enough to spit on," he said. "Fine for a parlor. Useless on a mountain? You're going to learn this gun." He showed her the grip. He showed her the stance. He showed her how to breathe. The first 3 shots she fired went wide. The 4th chipped the edge of a can. The 5th knocked one cleanly off the stump. Rhett whooped. Bo on the porch applauded with one mittened hand. "You're a natural," Rhett said. 5 more rounds. Do it again." She did it again. By the end of the afternoon, she had hit 12 cans out of 20 rounds. Her shoulder ached. Her ears rang. She felt for the first time in her adult life a kind of physical confidence she had not known existed. Rhett walked her back to the cabin with his hand resting lightly between her shoulder blades, the touch of an older brother, brisk and impersonal. "Tomorrow, the long rifle," he said. "Different beast. Same idea. You are not going to be the only person on this place without a weapon you can use, miss. That is not how we are doing this." Silas, that night at supper, did not ask how the shooting had gone. He had heard the shots all afternoon from where he was working on the south fence. But when she set the table, he caught her wrist briefly as she reached past him to put down a cup. His grip was extraordinarily light for a hand that size. She froze. He turned her hand over, palm up. A small, angry blister had formed on the meat below her thumb from the kick of the Colt. "Bear grease," he said. "Bo has a pot in the pantry. Put it on tonight before you sleep." He let her hand go. He did not look at her. He went on cutting his meat. She thought about that touch all evening, the lightness of it, the deliberateness. He had not held her wrist any longer than he had needed to. She thought about how a man as large as he was could move his hands so carefully. She thought about the way he had handed her the coffee that first morning, the way he had set the pot within her reach but had not poured for her. She thought, this man is teaching me in increments so small I am barely noticing that I am safe in this house. She put bear grease on her hand before she slept. A storm came in on the 5th night, not the screaming kind that had nearly killed her, but a steady, patient blizzard that buried the door to the eaves by morning and kept them inside for 2 full days. The 4 of them were trapped together in the cabin with the wind pressing against the windows and the fire roaring. It was during those 2 days that the talking happened. It happened in pieces. Rhett told her about the time a black bear had walked into the kitchen through an unlatched door and stood looking at him over the table for a full minute before turning around and walking out. Bo told her about the harmonica he carried in his pocket, which had been their father's, and he played a slow tune called Shenandoah that brought her unexpectedly close to tears. She told them in turn about her mother's funeral, about the Irish woman who had come to lay out the body and had sung a Gaelic lament that the priest had tried to stop and finally had given up trying. She told them about teaching French to a Beecham Street girl who had laughed every time Della pronounced the word for cat, which the child insisted sounded like a sneeze. Silas listened more than he spoke. But on the second night after Bo had gone to bed in the loft and Rhett had stretched out on the bench by the fire and fallen asleep with his hat over his face, Silas and Della were left alone at the kitchen table. The fire was low. The wind had quieted to a steady mutter. He had a cup of coffee in his hands that had long since gone cold. He had not refilled it. She said very quietly, "You have not told me about your sister." He did not answer for a long time. She thought she had gone too far. She was about to apologize when he spoke. "Annalise was 12," he said. "She had our mother's hair. Black. Most folks expect mountain children to be hardy. She was not. She was a bookish child. She wanted to be a teacher. She wrote me letters all through the war. I have them upstairs in a box. The last one she sent reached me in August of 76 in Wyoming. She wrote that she had read 3 new books that summer. She asked me to bring her something pretty when I came home. She died in October. I was discharged in March. I stood on the hillside with Bo and Rhett, and they showed me the 4 graves. And I went down to the saloon at the crossing that night, and I tried to get a man to kill me. He wouldn't. I came home at dawn. I dug the 4th grave that week. His voice did not crack. It only got lower and lower until it was nearly gone. I told myself he said that the 4th grave was for me. The truth is, it was for the man I used to be. I did not know that until last week. I thought I was burying myself. I was burying him. He looked up. The fire caught his eyes again. The whiskey was gold. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I do not know what you are to me yet. I do not know what I am to you. But I know that I have not spoken Annalise's name out loud in 3 years, and tonight I have spoken it twice, and the second time was easier than the first. I do not know what to do with that information. I am only telling it to you because you asked." Della reached very slowly across the table. She did not take his hand. She did not touch him. She laid her hand on the wood palm up between them. She did not speak. He looked at her hand for a long time. Then he put his own hand down, palm up beside hers, not on hers, beside hers. The edges of their fingers brushed for 1 second, the lightest possible contact, and a thing moved in her chest that had no name and needed none. The fire popped. Outside, the wind dropped to nothing. The storm was passing. He did not move his hand. She did not move hers. They stayed that way side by side on the kitchen table for a long, quiet minute. Then Rhett snored on the bench, and the spell broke softly, and Silas drew his hand back and stood and said goodnight and went out to the barn. Della sat by the dying fire alone for a while longer. She thought winter always ends. She did not know yet where she had heard that phrase. She would hear Silas say it 2 days later, looking at a thaw line on a fence post. She would hear him say it again in February after a wolf killed one of the heifers. She would hear it become the small private rhythm of the house, a thing said when things were hard, a thing said when nothing else would help. Winter always ends. She thought it now for the first time without knowing she was thinking it. She climbed into the narrow bed in the small room. She bolted the door behind her because that was the rule of the house, not because she was afraid. Then after a moment, she got up again. She unbolted it. She lay back down. She did not know what unbolting the door meant. She did not need to know yet. She only knew that the man on the cot in the barn who had carried her in from a screaming storm and made her breakfast and watched her hand on a kitchen table had earned somewhere between the snow and the firelight the small, quiet trust of an unbarred door. She slept. In the barn, Silas Thorne did not sleep. He lay on the cot in his coat with his rifle across his chest, and he stared at the rafters, and he listened to the slow creak of the cabin settling under the snow. He thought about the small, careful weight of 2 hands resting beside each other on rough pine wood. He thought about a name he had said out loud for the first time in 3 years. He thought about the empty grave on the hillside and about the man he had buried in it. He thought, "I do not know what she is to me yet." He thought, "I do not know what I am to her." But the thinking did not feel any more like the thinking of a dying man. It felt like the thinking of a man preparing for spring. Down at the crossing, 25 miles south, in the back room of the only saloon in town, 2 men from Boston were drinking coffee with a third man, a tracker named Hollis Dune, and showing him a tintype of a young woman with honey blonde hair. They asked him if he had seen anyone matching the description come through on the stage. The bartender who had heard about the wagon crash in the storm had already told them yes. They asked Hollis Dune if he could find the wreck. He said for the right money he could find anything. They paid him half up front and promised the other half on delivery. The next morning, Hollis Dune rode north out of Miller's Crossing into the Bitterroot with 2 Boston men trailing behind him and a $1,000 bounty in his saddlebag and instructions that read alive if possible. The woman, the man who took her dead if necessary. The wind that morning had come around out of the south. The thaw was beginning. The thaw line crept up the south side of every fence post in the Bitterroot like a slow tide. By the second week of January, it had risen 4 inches. By the third week, it had risen 7. The snow on the cabin roof began to slide in the afternoons in long, shuddering avalanches that thumped the eaves and made Bo look up from his work and say, "Listen, the mountain is letting go." Della began to understand that winter on a Montana homestead was not one season, but a dozen smaller ones, each with its own weather and its own meaning, and that the men around her read those small seasons the way she had once read the chapters of a novel. The morning Rhett rode in from his trap line with snow on his shoulders and his face set hard. She was outside the cabin pinning wash to a line strung between two pines. Bo was in the barn. Silas was up on the south fence 2 ridges over, laying new rails where the wolves had gotten into the cattle pen. Rhett swung down off his horse without tying him, and the horse stood the way Rhett's horse always stood when something was wrong, ears up, breath steaming, waiting. Della, inside. She did not ask. She gathered the basket of pins and walked. He came in behind her and shut the door. He did not take off his coat. He walked to the rifle pegs above the door and took down the long rifle and laid it on the table. There were tracks in the snow up by the North Creek, he said. 3 horses, 2 riders shod for town. Eastern saddles, you can tell by the print. A third pair of tracks belongs to a horse I know. That horse belongs to a man named Hollis Doone. Doone is a tracker out of Helena. He hires himself out for finding things, mostly cattle, sometimes people. She felt the breath leave her body all at once. How far, she said. 2 days behind, Rhett said. Maybe less. They are working slow because Doone is good and he is being careful, and because the snow is melting in the afternoons and freezing again at night, and that is hard country to track in. But they are coming up the creek. They will be on this side of the ridge by tomorrow night. Day after at the latest. How many? 3, including Doone. Della sat down on the bench. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her so that she could feel the wood. She thought about the silver derringer in her carpet bag. She thought about the Colt revolver Rhett had taught her to shoot. She thought about the long rifle on the table. I will get Silas, Rhett said. No, she said. Sit down. Tell me everything you know about how Hollis Doone works. Rhett looked at her. Then he sat down. And he told her. Doone, he said, was a man who had run scouts for the army during the Indian campaigns and had since gone private. He was 45, lean as a knife blade, did not drink, did not gamble, did not waste a word. He worked for whoever paid. He had brought a man back to a hanging from the Yukon once 3 months overland in winter, and the man had been alive when he arrived. Doone did not lose what he was sent for. The 2 men with him would be Pemberton's Eastern men, no good in the country, but they would have money and they would have papers. What papers, Della said. A warrant, probably, Rhett said, or something dressed up to look like one. Pemberton has lawyers. He will have done it legal looking. They will come to the door with documents that say you are an absconding debtor and that you stole the pistol and that they have authority to take you back to Massachusetts. If we resist on paper, we are interfering with a lawful arrest on paper. Della nodded slowly. She said, then we cannot kill them. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. That is correct, he said. We cannot kill them. Not unless they shoot first, and if they are smart, they will not. Doone will not shoot first. Doone will hand over a paper. Della said, then we have to make them choose to leave. Rhett's mouth pulled to one side, almost a smile, but not quite. Now you are thinking like a thorn, he said. Get Silas, she said. Get Bo. We need all of us at this table within the hour. Rhett went out. She sat in the empty cabin with her hands flat on the wood, and she did not let herself shake. She thought, I have been a frightened woman for 3 years, and I have just stopped being one. She did not know exactly when she had stopped. Sometime between the kitchen table the night of the storm and this moment. Sometime when she had not been watching it happen. The 4 of them sat at the table inside an hour. Silas came in last, his face hard from the cold and harder from what Rhett had told him on the way down. He hung his coat. He walked to the table. He did not sit. He stood across from her and looked at her, and the look on his face was the look of a man who was about to ask her to make a choice. Silas, she said. Sit, he sat. I have been thinking, she said, since Rhett told me, Hollis Doone is going to come with papers. He will not shoot first. The papers will say I am a debtor and a thief. If you fight him on the porch with rifles, even if you win, the law in Helena will come for you. Pemberton will see to it. He will have witnesses. He will have a sheriff. He will burn this place down inside of a season, and you 3 will be in a federal prison or hanged. That is what Pemberton wants. He does not actually need me. He needs to win. He needs Boston to see that nobody crosses Cyrus Pemberton. Silas was very still. So were his brothers. I have one chance, she said, and the chance is this. I have been hiding from him for 4 months. I have not fought him. I have run. He has built his whole case on the fact that I am running. So I am going to stop running. What does that mean? Said Bo quietly. It means Della said that I am going to write a letter tonight to a lawyer in Helena. A real one. Not a frontier shyster, a man with a name back east. I am going to tell that lawyer exactly what Cyrus Pemberton did to my father and to his first wife and to me. I am going to send affidavits. I am going to send the page from my father's appointment book that proves he was in Concord on the day of the second loan and could not possibly have signed papers in Boston. I am going to put my name on the record. I am going to make myself on paper the accuser before he can make me on paper the accused. The first one to file is the one the law believes. That is how it works in Massachusetts. I would guess it works the same way here. Silas said, "You have your father's appointment book." I have a page from it. She said, "I tore it out of the parlor desk before I left Boston. I knew what the second loan said. I knew it was a forgery. I did not know what I was going to do with the page. Now I do." Rhett let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Lord above," he said. "She came up that mountain with a derringer and a piece of evidence sewed into her coat." Della almost smiled. Bo said, "What about Dune? What about the men coming up the creek tomorrow?" Della said, "That is the second part. We are going to let them come." Silas said, "No." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "we are going to let them come, Silas. And when they come, we are going to be ready, and we are going to give them something to take back to Pemberton that is not me." What said Silas? "A signed deposition," she said, "witnessed by a federal marshal." Silas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Teddy Calloway," he said. "Yes," said Della. The man you served with, the man you wrote me about in October, the one you said was the only honest badge between Helena and Salt Lake. How did you remember that?" Silas said. "I remember everything you wrote me," she said quietly. "Every line." There was a small, thick silence at the table. Bo was looking at the floor. Rhett was looking at Silas. Silas was looking at her. And there was something happening in his face that was not granite anymore. Sen Bo, Della said, "Tonight, he rides best in the dark, and Dune will not be looking for a rider, going out only for riders coming in. Bo goes to Helena. Bo finds Calloway. Bo brings him back here under federal authority. If Calloway is on this porch when Dune arrives, Dune will hand his papers to Calloway, and Calloway will hand them back to Dune with a word about jurisdiction and forgery, and Dune will turn around. Dune is not stupid. Dune does not work a job that has gone bad." "How long does Bo need?" said Rhett. "4 days," said Silas slowly. "3 if he kills the horse." Bo said, "I am not killing a horse. I will do it in 3 on Cinder. Cinder can do it." Della said, "Then we have 3 days. We have to hold this place for 3 days while Bo rides. That is the second piece of the plan." She drew a breath. "We do not engage them," she said. "Not at the door, not on the porch. We do not let them see me. Dune is good, but he is one man, and he has to sleep, and so do the Boston men. They will camp at the meadow below the lower pasture. They will scout up to the cabin at first light. We get to that meadow first. We are not going to fight them. We are going to spook them. Every night, for 3 nights in the dark, we are going to make this mountain feel haunted. We move their picket line. We let their horses loose. We rake snow over their tracks. We fire 1 rifle from the ridge above their camp at midnight and put a ball into the dirt 20 feet from their fire. Not at them, near them. 3 nights of that, and Dune will start to think the country is against him. Boston men will not last 2 of those nights. They will be begging Dune to retreat by the 3rd. Rhett was grinning now, openly. "She has been a soldier the whole time," he said. "She was just hiding it." Silas was not smiling. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table in the storm, and there was something in his eyes that was past granite and past whiskey and into something hotter and more difficult. He said, "You understand that if any one of those men dies on this mountain in the next 3 days, Pemberton wins." "I understand," she said. He said, "You understand we will not be sleeping in this cabin for 3 nights. We will be on the ridges in the cold. You will be alone with a rifle." "I understand," she said. He said, "You understand if Dune is better than we think, he will find one of us in the dark, and that man will not come home." "I understand," she said. She added very quietly, "but I would rather we do this thing my way than have you bury one of your brothers because Cyrus Pemberton wanted me to be afraid one more time." Silas Thorne sat looking at her for a long second. Then he stood up. He walked around the table. He put his hand on her shoulder just for a moment, the weight of a kept promise. He did not speak. He did not have to. He went to the door, took down his coat, and said over his shoulder, "Bo, you ride at sunset. Rhett with me. We are going up to find every blind on every ridge above the meadow before dark. Della, you are going to write the letter to the lawyer and Helena, and you are going to write it well because Bo is carrying it tonight along with everything else." She wrote the letter at the kitchen table by the light of 2 candles while the brothers worked outside. She wrote in her best copperplate the hand she had learned in the Beacon Hill schoolroom from a woman who had rapped her knuckles whenever a letter slanted wrong. She named names. She named dates. She described the parlor scene in February of 1880 when Pemberton had laid the forged papers in front of her. She quoted his sentence about the debtor's hostel. She described plainly, without embellishment, the maid in Albany and the late Margaret Pemberton on the back staircase. She enclosed the page from her father's appointment book. She enclosed a notarized statement of her own hand signed Cordelia Ashcroft this 15th day of January, 1883, at Thorn Ridge, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, witnessed by Silas Thorne and Beauregard Thorne, residents of said place. She sealed the envelope. She addressed it to Bartholomew Quill, Esquire, the attorney at law, Helena, Montana Territory, with a second note inside instructing Quill to forward copies by wire and post to the offices of 3 named partners in Boston. She gave the envelope to Beau as he saddled Cinder in the failing light. "Beau," she said. "Miss, if you do not come back," she said, "I will never forgive myself. I am coming back," he said. "I am the youngest. The youngest always comes back. That is the law." He tied the letter inside his coat lining. He swung up onto Cinder. He looked down at her. The whiskey eyes were warm and steady. "Miss Della," he said, "when you do decide what you are to my brother, he is going to say yes. I just want you to know that, so you can choose without wondering." Then he reined Cinder around and put his heel to the horse and was gone down the lower trail at a fast trot before the sun had touched the last ridge. Silas and Rhett were already up on the high blinds. She watched their 2 figures disappear into the timber above the meadow, each carrying a rifle and a wool blanket and a small leather sack of jerky. They had told her before they went where to be and what to do. She was to bar the cabin from the inside. She was to put out all but one lamp. She was to keep the long rifle loaded across her knees by the front window. She was to fire it once into the air. If anyone tried to come up onto the porch, they would hear it from the ridges and they would come. She did exactly what they had told her. She did not sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, far up on the dark mountain, she heard a single rifle crack, sharp and clean as a thrown stone in still water, then nothing for an hour, then very faintly the high distant whinny of a horse that had bolted and was running. She closed her eyes for a moment. She whispered, "Well done," to no one in particular. Then she went and rebanked the fire and sat down again with the long rifle across her knees. At first light, Silas came in alone. He was caked with frost. His beard had ice in it. His eyes were bloodshot. He stood inside the door, and he did not take off his coat. He looked at her sitting by the window with the rifle, and he said one word, "Coffee." She put the pot on. He sank down at the table. She brought him the cup. He drank half of it without breathing. "Red is up there still," he said, watching them. They camped at the meadow, 3 of them. Dune, 2 Boston men. We waited until they bedded down. Then I went down through the timber on foot, and I cut the picket line on 2 of their horses. Rhett fired the one shot from the ridge 20 feet off their fire. The Boston men were on their feet, shouting before the echo died. Dune did not shout. Dune went very still and looked at the ridge and put another log on the fire and sat back down with his rifle across his knees. He knows somebody is up there. He does not know how many. "What about the horses?" She said. 2 of them ran north. The third was Dune's, and Dune had it tied closer to him on a separate line. We could not get to it in the dark without him hearing us, so they have 1 horse for 3 men in the morning. That is enough. She nodded. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he said, "we do it again. Different ridge, different sound. We move their fire ring if we can, while one of them goes looking for the loose horses. We are going to make them feel watched. Dune will not break. The Boston men will. By tomorrow night, Dune will have 2 terrified rich men begging him to retreat. Silas." She paused. "Did anyone get hurt?" "No," he said. "Not a hair on anyone. Not a single shot at a man. Just at the dirt." She let her shoulders drop. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding them. He looked at her across the table. The frost was melting in his beard. There was a small drop of water on his eyelash. She had the very strange and very strong urge to reach across and brush it away. She did not. He said, "You have not slept." "Neither have you," she said. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth lifted maybe a quarter inch. It was the first time she had seen it move in any direction other than down. He said, "Sleep an hour." "I will sit. If anything happens, I will wake you," she said. "Only if you sleep an hour after I do." He nodded once. She went and lay down on the long bench by the fire, pulled a blanket over herself, and slept hard for 1 hour. She woke to find that he had not moved from the table. He was watching the door with the long rifle across his knees and his hand wrapped loosely around the cold remains of his coffee. He did not look at her when she sat up, but he said quietly, "You sleep with your jaw set. I do not think you have slept relaxed in a long time." "I have not," she said. "Maybe you will," he said. "Someday. On this mountain." She did not answer that. There was no answer that would not have meant more than she was ready to say in daylight. The second night was worse. It was colder. The wind had come back, not the screaming wind of December, but a steady low wind that cut through wool. Della sat at the cabin window with the long rifle and counted her own breaths to keep herself awake. Around 2 in the morning, she heard a flurry of shots up on the ridge. 4 shots in quick succession from a heavy rifle, and then a single answering crack that she recognized even at distance as Rhett's piece. Her heart stopped. She put her hand on the door bar. She did not open it. She made herself wait the way they had told her. At dawn, Rhett came in. He was alone. She was on her feet before he had the door shut. "Where is he?" she said. "He is fine," Rhett said. "He is up there still. We had a closer thing tonight. One of the Boston men, the bigger one, came scouting up the slope on foot at midnight. He had a rifle. He was not very good with it, but he was determined. He got within 30 yards of where Cy was lying in a snowblind. Cy had to move. The Boston man fired 4 times at the shadow he saw move. None of them hit anything. Cy put a ball into a tree 6 feet over the man's head as a courtesy. The man dropped his rifle and ran back down to the meadow without it. We have his rifle now. Silas is keeping watch in case he comes back. He is not coming back." She made herself sit down. She said, "The Boston men, they are breaking." They are broken," Rhett said. The smaller one was crying. When they got back to the fire, I could hear him from where I was. He is begging Dune to leave. Dune is sitting on a stump, cleaning his pistol and saying nothing. Dune is the question mark. Dune is waiting for Bo to come back, she said. He is waiting to see what kind of mountain he is on. Rhett looked at her. "You see things very clearly, miss," he said. "Has anybody ever told you that?" "My father did," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "One more night. We can hold one more night. Bo should be coming back into the lower trail with Calloway by tomorrow afternoon if all has gone well in Helena. If we make Dune sit through one more dark night thinking his employers are losing their minds by the time the federal marshal rides into that meadow, this thing will end without a shot fired at a person." She nodded. "Rhett," she said. "Yes." "Tell Silas when you go back, tell him that I said he is to come down and sleep 4 hours in the cabin tonight before he goes up. Tell him I said it. Tell him I will sit the window with the long rifle. Tell him if he argues, I will say it again, louder." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. "I will tell him," he said. "He will not argue." He went out. Silas came down at dusk. He came in without a word. He hung his coat. He walked to the bench by the fire and lay down on it the way she had lain on it the morning before. He did not even take his boots off. She brought him a blanket. He took it without opening his eyes. She covered him. She sat at the kitchen table with the long rifle and watched the fire and watched him. He slept the way exhausted men sleep, deep and motionless with his face turned toward the room. In sleep, the granite of his face softened. The lines around his eyes eased. She could see faintly the shape of the man he must have been before the war and the empty grave and the 3 years of waiting to die. She could see faintly what Bo had said 2 weeks ago about a man who had not let himself want anything, finally letting himself want one thing. She watched him for a long time. Around midnight, far up the mountain, she heard one rifle shot, then nothing. Then an hour later, another shot, then nothing. Rhett was working alone tonight on the ridge, doing the work of 2 men and doing it well. Silas did not stir. Della did not wake him. She sat with the long rifle across her knees, and she thought, this is what it is to keep a household. This is what my mother did for my father on the other side of the country in another life. This is how it is done. You sit, you wait, you watch the fire, you let the man sleep. He woke at 4 a.m. He sat up on the bench. He looked at her in the lamplight, and for a moment he did not seem to know where he was. "Sleep," he said. "Your turn." "I will sleep when this is finished," she said. He stood. He walked to the kitchen table. He poured a cup of cold coffee from the pot. He drank it. He set the cup down. He looked at her, and the look was the same look he had given her that afternoon in November when he had read her last letter sitting on this porch in the rain, except now she could see it. "Della," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her given name without the miss in front of it. "I have been thinking on that ridge about what I want to say to you when this is over." She did not answer. She waited. "I do not have it ready yet," he said. "I want you to know that I am working on it." She felt her eyes fill. She did not let them spill. "I will wait," she said. He nodded once. He took the long rifle from her hands. He picked up his coat. He paused with one hand on the latch, and this time he did turn back. "A man keeps his word, Miss Ashcroft," he said. "I am keeping mine." Then he went out into the dark for the 3rd night. The 3rd night was the quietest. Sometime around midnight, Rhett came down off his ridge alone, walking through the timber in fresh snow, and he reported to Silas that the Boston men had tried to leave at dusk on Dune's horse, the only horse they had, and that Dune had stopped them at the picket line and told them to sit back down. Dune had given them an extra ration of whiskey from his saddlebag and told them to get themselves through one more night. Then Dune had gone and sat by the fire alone, and he had taken off his hat, and he had looked up at the dark ridges around the meadow, and he had spoken not loudly but clearly into the night like a man addressing a mountain. I do not know who you are up there, Dune had said. I know you are not Indians. I know you are not road agents. I know my own work. You have not killed me, and you could have. I am going to make a guess. I am going to guess you are a husband and that the woman in question is more than a paying job to you. If I am right about that, raise your gun and fire one shot into the trees south of my fire. If I am wrong, do not fire. If I see one shot south of the fire in the next minute, I am going to break camp at first light and ride south, and I am going to tell my employer that the woman is dead in the storm. That is my offer. The minute starts now. Silas in the snowblind on the high ridge heard every word of it. Dune had spoken loud enough on purpose. Silas thought about it for 15 seconds. Then he raised his rifle and he fired one shot into the timber south of the meadow, and the bullet went wide of every man and into the trunk of an old fir and lodged there harmlessly. The echo rolled around the bowl of the meadow and faded. Down at the fire, Hollis Dune put his hat back on. He nodded once. He said nothing else. He banked the fire for the night and lay down in his bedroll with his rifle beside him, and he slept the sleep of a man who had finished a piece of work to his own satisfaction. At dawn, Dune broke camp, took the two Boston men, took the one remaining horse, and rode south out of the meadow without ever looking back at the ridges. They did not stop at the cabin. They did not stop at Miller's Crossing. The story Dune delivered to Cyrus Pemberton in Boston 3 weeks later at a cost of $1,000, and the two Boston men's own depositions was that Cordelia Ashcroft had died in a wagon crash on the 22nd of December, 1882, that her body had not been recovered owing to the depth of the drifts that Hollis Dune had personally located, the wreckage of the wagon and the dead horse, and that any further pursuit of the matter would be useless, expensive, and a stain upon the name of the man who pursued it. But that was 3 weeks away. In Montana, on the morning Dune rode out of the meadow, Silas Thorne came down off his ridge for the last time. He crossed the lower pasture in the new sun. The thaw had come up another inch overnight. The aspens at the creek were beginning to show their first faint red bud at the tip of every branch. The mountain smelled of running water. Bo and the federal marshal, Theodore Calloway, rode in from the south at noon. Calloway was a thin, gray man with a star pinned to his coat and an expression that said he had ridden hard for 2 days and intended to find out why. Della met them on the porch with coffee and with her father's appointment book in her hand. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. By the end of the 2 hours, Calloway had a folder of sworn statements thicker than a Bible, an arrest order to be wired to Boston, and a quiet personal promise to Silas Thorne, his old comrade in arms, that if Cyrus Pemberton ever set one boot west of the Mississippi again, he would not see east of it. Calloway left at dusk. Bo put up his horse. Rhett came down off the ridge for supper, and for the first time in 3 nights, all 4 of them sat at the table together and ate food that Della had cooked, and she watched the 3 brothers across the lamplight, and she thought, I did not know I was capable of loving 3 men at once in 3 different ways. I love Bo like a brother I never had. I love Rhett like a friend I will fight beside for the rest of my life. And the third one was looking at her over the lamp, and his eyes in the lamplight were not gold tonight. They were a quieter color. They were the color of a thing decided. After supper, when Bo had gone up to the loft and Red had taken his pipe out onto the porch, Silas stood and held out his hand to her. Walk with me, he said. She took his hand. They walked out into the mild January night. The thaw had brought a strange warm breath up the valley. Stars were out. The cabin behind them glowed yellow through its windows. He led her up the small rise behind the house to a place where a single fir tree stood alone above the hayfield, and beneath it 4 small grave markers, and beside those 4, a 5th depression in the earth that had been dug long ago and never filled. He stopped beside the empty grave. He looked at it. Della, he said, I dug this for myself 3 years ago. I told you that. What I did not tell you, because I did not know how to say it, is that I have been standing beside it every Sunday morning since you wrote your first letter, and I have been having the same argument with myself every Sunday. The argument was about whether a man like me has any right to ask a woman like you to share a life with him. He turned to her. His face in the starlight was not granite anymore. It was a man's face, plain and tired and open. I have not finished the argument, he said. I do not know if I ever will, but I am done arguing it alone. So I am going to say out loud and to you what I have been saying to this hole in the ground every Sunday for 6 months. I would like to fill in this grave, Della. I would like to fill it in with my own shovel tomorrow in the daylight with you beside me, and I would like, when it is filled, to ask you to marry me. Not because of an arrangement and not because there is nowhere else for you to go, because you came up this mountain in a storm, and you walked into my house and you put your hand on a kitchen table, palm up beside mine, and I have not been the same man since." She did not answer in words. She put both of her hands on his chest, over the heart she had heard beating against her cheek the night he carried her in, and she leaned forward and she put her forehead against the rough wool of his coat, and she stayed there. He brought his arms around her, slowly, carefully, the way he did everything. The night was very still. After a long time, she lifted her head and she looked up at him in the starlight, and she said, "Yes, tomorrow, with your shovel, with me beside you." He bent and he kissed her once, a single kiss in the cold mountain air, brief and grave and certain, the kiss of a man who had made up his mind and would not unmake it again in this lifetime. Then he took her hand and they walked back down to the cabin where the lamps were burning, and Rhett on the porch saw them coming and tapped his pipe out against the rail and said, "Well, about time." Inside, the fire was still bright, and outside in the high, silent country above the homestead, the thaw line on every fence post had risen one more inch towards spring. The grave was filled in the next morning. Silas did the digging. Della stood beside him with her hands in the pockets of the buffalo coat that had once belonged to his mother, and she watched the giant of a man bend his back to the work of burying the version of himself that had been waiting in that hole for 3 years. The earth was hard. He had to break it with a pickaxe before the shovel would take it. Bo and Rhett came up the rise once halfway through with 2 cups of coffee. They did not speak. They handed the cups over and they walked back down. They knew, in the way brothers know, that this was not a moment for help. When the last shovel of earth was tamped flat over the place where the grave had been, Silas straightened up. He looked at the 4 small markers beside it. He looked at his father's. He looked at his mother's. He looked at Annalise's, which was the smallest. He took off his hat. "I will see you all again," he said quietly, "but not for a long time yet." He put his hat back on. He turned to Della. "I asked you a question last night," he said. "I would like to ask it properly today, with my hat off and my hands clean." She nodded. He took his hat off again. He went to one knee on the cold spring earth beside the freshly closed grave. He looked up at her. "Cordelia Ashcroft," he said, "will you marry me?" She said yes. He stood. He did not kiss her. He put his hat back on, and he took her hand and he walked her back down to the cabin where Bo was making biscuits and Rhett was building the fire, and Silas said simply, she said yes, and Bo looked up with flour on his face and gave a single low whoop of joy, and Rhett crossed the room and clasped his older brother's shoulder and said, "Brother, it is about damn time." And Silas almost smiled, and the cabin was warm, and the morning sun was coming through the small windows, and outside on the small rise above the hayfield, the empty grave was no longer empty, and the man it had been dug for was no longer the man who had dug it. They were married on the first Sunday of April. The aspens along the creek were just beginning to leaf out the first pale green smoke of them against the dark of the pines. The grass in the lower meadow had come back. The cattle had wandered up out of the timber and were grazing the new chutes. Della wore a dress that had been her mother's, that she had carried 2,000 miles in the bottom of her trunk and had not unpacked until that week. It was cream-colored with small embroidered violets at the collar and cuffs. She braided her hair with sprigs of sagebrush from the south slope. She wore her mother's cameo brooch at her throat. The Reverend Obadiah Whitfield rode up from Miller's Crossing on a dappled mare. He was a tall, thin Methodist with white whiskers and a Bible older than he was. May O'Branigan came with him in a buckboard with her father and 2 of her younger brothers, and she had brought a pie. Federal Marshal Theodore Calloway came up from Helena with his wife, a stout, cheerful woman named Hannah, who took one look at Della and said, "Oh, dear thing, you have been through it," and folded her into a hug as if they had been friends for 20 years. Bo had carved 2 rings from a piece of cedar he had pulled out of a stump on the south slope the autumn before, when he confessed later he had begun to suspect his brother might have a use for them someday. Rhett had polished 2 small pieces of placer gold he had panned out of the creek over the winter, and Bo had set the gold into the cedar so that each ring carried a thin, glinting line of the mountain itself. The ceremony was held in the meadow above the cabin beneath a single tall pine that the brother's father had planted the year Silas was born. The Reverend Whitfield read from the book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." When it came time for the vows, Silas spoke first. He had been working on the words for weeks, Bo told her later. He had been muttering them to the cattle, to the woodpile, to the edge of the porch in the early morning before the others were awake. When he finally said them aloud, they came out simple. Della, I am not a man who knows how to say beautiful things. I will not pretend otherwise today, so I will say only what is true. I have lived on this mountain for 33 years. For 30 of those, I was the man who came after my father. For 3 of those, I was no man at all. For the last 100 days, I have been the man you have made me. I do not deserve you. I will spend whatever years are given to me trying to. A man keeps his word, Della. Today is my word. Della spoke second. Silas Thorne, I came up this mountain expecting to keep an arrangement. I am leaving this meadow today as your wife. Between those two truths is everything I will ever be. I give you my hand, I give you my name, I give you whatever I have left to give, and I give you my promise, which is this. Wherever the storm comes from, whichever side of the door it knocks on, I will not flinch from it again. I will stand. We will stand. She slid the cedar and gold ring onto his finger. He slid the smaller one onto hers. The Reverend Whitfield closed his Bible, and Silas Thorne kissed his wife, once a gentle kiss in the spring sunlight beside a pine tree his father had planted in 1849. And the small group on the meadow clapped, and Mayo Brannigan cried into her father's coat, and Bo pulled out the harmonica and played a slow tune that turned after a few bars into something faster and brighter a reel. That night, when the wedding supper was eaten and the marshal and the Reverend and the O'Brannigans had ridden back down to the crossing, Silas carried his bride across the threshold of their bedroom and closed the door behind them. Outside, a soft April rain began to fall on the new grass of the Bitterroot Valley. The fire in the main room burned down to embers. Bo slept in the loft. Rhett sat on the porch in the rain with his pipe and watched the storm pass over the mountain, and he smiled to himself in the dark. By morning, everything had changed between them, and nothing had. They came out of the bedroom for breakfast hand in hand. Bo at the stove took one look at his brother's face, which was relaxed in a way Bo had never seen it, and he said softly, "Welcome home, Si." And Silas looked at him and said, "Thank you, brother," and then sat down to eat with his wife on his right and his brothers across the table from him for the first time as a married man. Spring came in fast that year. The aspens leafed out fully by the second week of April. The creek ran high and brown for 10 days and then settled to a clear, ringing run over stones. The cattle calved twin heifers from the same cow, which Rhett said was a sign, and Silas said was a sign of nothing but a strong cow, but he said it with a smile. Della began that spring to learn the place in earnest. She rode with Rhett to check the trap lines and on her own to gather wild greens along the lower creek, and with Bo to hunt grouse in the brushy draws above the hayfield. Bo showed her the small clearing he had been planting with garden seeds for 2 years, getting nothing to grow because he was a poor gardener, and she laughed and told him he had been planting in shade and pulled him out into the sunny half-acre on the south side of the cabin and showed him where to put the rows. By midsummer, they had peas and lettuce and beans and turnips and a stand of corn that came up to her waist by August. In May, Silas took her up to the high meadow to show her the upper boundary of the homestead. They rode up through the timber on a clear morning, and when they came out at the high meadow, there were elk grazing 200 yards off a cow and 2 yearlings, and they sat on their horses and watched until the elk lifted their heads and moved off into the timber. "You came 2,000 miles to see this," he said. "I came 2,000 miles to find you," she said. "The elk are a dividend." He laughed. It was the first full laugh she had ever heard from him, a real laugh, and the sound rolled across the meadow and startled a hawk out of a snag. In June, a letter came from Bartholomew Quill in Helena. Della read it on the porch in the long evening light. Cyrus Pemberton had been arrested in Boston by federal warrant on 4 counts of fraud, 2 counts of forgery, and 1 count of suspicion of murder in the death of his first wife, the maid in Albany, having been located and persuaded by Quill's agents to swear out a deposition. Pemberton had posted bond. He had attempted to flee to Canada. He had been intercepted in upstate New York. He was at the time of writing awaiting trial in a Boston jail. Quill anticipated a conviction. Della read the letter twice, then she folded it, walked down to the small rise behind the cabin, and sat on the bench Silas had built for her there at the edge of the family graves. She did not cry, she did not feel triumph, she felt instead a quiet sorrow for Margaret Pemberton, who had not lived to see this, and for her father, who had not either. She sat there until Silas came up looking for her at dusk. "Is it bad news?" he said. "It is good news," she said. "It is the best possible news. I am only sitting with it for a while." He sat down beside her. He did not press. He took her hand. They watched the sun go down over the western ridge. That summer, the 4 of them built an addition onto the cabin, a new bedroom off the kitchen for Silas and Della. The old small bedroom Della had first woken in became a sewing room. Bo moved his things down out of the loft into the second main floor room. Rhett kept the loft. They built the addition with their own hands, log by log, in the long evenings when the cattle work was done. Della helped peel bark from the logs and chink the gaps with a mixture of clay and horsehair Bo had taught her to make. By the time the first frost came in late September, the addition was tight and warm and finished. On the night of the first hard frost, Della told Silas, sitting by the new hearth in the new bedroom, that she was carrying a child. He went very still. He looked at her, his eyes filled. He did not cry. He pulled her against his chest, and he held her, and he said into her hair, "Thank you, Della. Thank you." The baby came in early May of 1884, a daughter. The labor was long and hard, 18 hours, and May O'Branigan, who had ridden up from Miller's Crossing as soon as Rhett had come down to fetch her, sat with Della through most of it and held her hand through the worst. When the baby came finally in the gray hour before dawn, she was small and red-faced and furious with a tuft of dark hair and lungs like a cavalry bugler. May cleaned her and wrapped her and laid her on Della's chest. Silas was let into the room 10 minutes later. He had been pacing the porch for 18 hours. Bo and Rhett had taken turns sitting with him and bringing him coffee he did not drink. He came into the bedroom on legs that did not seem to belong to him. He looked at his wife. He looked at the small, dark-haired creature on her chest. He sat down very carefully on the edge of the bed. "Hold her," Della whispered. "I will break her," Silas said. "You will not," Della said. "Hold your daughter." He took the baby with hands that for the first time in his life were not steady. He cradled her against his chest. He looked down at her face. The baby opened her eyes, which were a deep, dark blue, and she looked up at him. His shoulders began to shake. He did not make a sound. The tears ran down into his beard. Della watched him and did not speak because she understood that this was a thing happening to him that did not need words. After a long time, he said, "What shall we name her?" Della had been thinking about it for months. She had not said the name aloud. She said it now. "Annalise," she said, "after your sister." And Silas closed his eyes. The tears came faster. He did not let her go. He said after a long moment, "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Della said. "I want her to have a name that means something on this mountain. I want your sister to have her name spoken in this house every day for the rest of our lives." He bent and pressed his lips to the baby's forehead. "Annalise Thorne," he said, "welcome home." The years began to move faster after that. In 1886, Rhett married May O'Branigan in a small ceremony in the meadow above the cabin beneath the same pine where Silas and Della had stood 3 years before. May was a tall, freckled redhead with a laugh you could hear across the valley and a stubbornness that was, Rhett swore, the only force in nature he had ever met that could match his own. They built their own cabin half a mile down the south slope on the easier ground. May's father gave them a milk cow and 4 laying hens as a wedding present. May was pregnant by Christmas of that year. In 1887, Della and Silas had a son. They named him Edmund after her father. He came easier than Annalise had, and he was a quieter baby with his father's dark chestnut hair and his mother's blue eyes. In 1889, Rhett and May's first child was born, a boy they named Hamish after his grandfather. The cabin on the south slope filled up with the babies crying and May singing and Rhett's surprisingly tender lullabies. In 1890, Bo, who at 34 had begun to seem to himself as if he were always going to be the brother who watched the others marry and never married himself, made a trip to Miller's Crossing for nails and came back 2 days later with news. He had met a young widow at the dry goods. Her name was Hester Driscoll. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Pearl. Her husband had died of pneumonia the winter before, and she had been keeping books for the O'Branigans to make ends meet. Bo had taken a long look at her over a stack of horseshoes and had felt he told Della later the same thing his brother Silas had once told him about the first time he had read a letter from Boston in the rain. Bo and Hester were married in October of that year. They took the room off the kitchen of the main cabin where Bo already lived, and Pearl moved into a serious, quiet child who had her mother's chestnut hair and a way of climbing into Silas's lap in the evenings that Silas pretended to suffer with great solemnity and that everyone in the family understood was the deepest joy of his middle age. In 1892, Della had her third child, a girl whom they named Marguerite after Silas's mother. In 94, a boy Hamish Jr. named for Silas's father. There were now 6 children running in and out of the main cabin on any given day. Annalise and Edmund and Marguerite and the baby Hamish, plus Pearl and her younger half-brother, who Bo and Hester had named for the youngest brother, Bo himself, plus Rhett and May's 2 boys, who came up from the lower cabin most mornings to chase chickens and pester their uncles. The Thornridge homestead was no longer a cabin. By 1895, it had become a small community: two cabins, three barns, a hen house, a smokehouse, a small lean-to that Beau had converted into a schoolroom where Della, who had not forgotten how to teach French and piano to little girls, taught all the children of the homestead and three more from the neighbor place down the valley 4 mornings a week. In 98, a one-room schoolhouse was built 2 miles down at the head of the valley, paid for in part by Della from a sum she had inherited after long legal proceedings from the seized estate of Cyrus Pemberton, who had died in a Massachusetts prison in 1892. Della used the money to build the school and to buy books for it and to pay a teacher's salary. The first teacher was a young woman named Florence Crandall, who had come west looking for work after the death of her father, and Della read her application letter at the kitchen table one evening and looked up at Silas and said, "This one, she is the one." And Silas, who had learned by then to trust his wife's reading of letters, absolutely said, "Write her back tonight." In 1904, Annalise Thorne, who was 20 years old and tall and dark-haired and who wanted, like the aunt she had never met, to be a teacher, married a young doctor from Helena named John Carlyle. The wedding was held on the meadow above the cabin beneath the same pine. The bride wore the cream-colored dress with the violets at the collar, which had now been worn by three brides on the same meadow, Della and May, and now Annalise, and which was beginning to be spoken of in the family as the dress. In 1906, Annalise gave birth to a daughter. The baby was small and dark-haired with eyes that everyone agreed were the color of cornflower. Annalise wrote a letter from Helena on a Tuesday in March, announcing the birth and announcing the name, and Della read the letter at the kitchen table, and then she walked out onto the porch and sat down on the bench Silas had built for her 23 years before, and she cried for a long time quietly while the spring sun came up over the eastern ridge. Annalise had named the baby Cordelia. By the spring of 1908, when this story comes finally to its long sunlit end, Silas Thorne was 59 years old. His beard was white at the corners of his mouth. His shoulders were still broad, but they bent a little now. He walked with a slight catch in his left knee, the legacy of a fall from a horse the autumn before. His hair was iron gray. His eyes, when he looked at his wife, were still the color of whiskey held up to a fire. Della was 50. There was silver at her temples and at the part of her honey blonde hair, which she still wore loose and pinned at the nape as she had the first morning in the cabin 25.5 years earlier. Her hands had turned brown and capable from 26 summers of gardening. Her cornflower blue eyes had a small fan of lines at the corners, now the lines of a woman who had laughed often. It was a Sunday in May. Annalise and her husband John were visiting from Helena with little Cordelia, who at 2 years old was a wide-eyed, serious child who had taken to following her grandfather around the yard with the gravity of a small judge. Edmund, 21, was running the cattle operation now alongside his father, and was engaged to a girl from the neighbor place down the valley named Sarah Hollister, who was at the cabin that day helping her future mother-in-law shell peas. Marguerite, 16, was reading a book of poetry on the porch with her feet up on the rail. Hamish Jr., 14, was somewhere down at the creek with two of Rhett and May's boys, all of them muddy and noisy and entirely happy. Beau, 52, came up from his cabin with Hester to bring 2 pies and to see the new grandchild. Rhett, 55, gray now at his temples, came up from his cabin with May and 3 of their 5 children to do the same. The small rise behind the cabin where the family graves had sat for so long now had a 6th marker beside the original 5. Hester's daughter Pearl had died at 15 of a fever, and she was buried there beside Silas's parents and his sister Annalise, and the family climbed the rise sometimes on Sundays to sit with her. That afternoon, Della was on the porch alone. She had a basket of peas in her lap. The men were at the lower fence. The children were everywhere. The cabin door was open. The smell of bread baking came out through the door. Silas came up from the cattle pen. He was dusty. His shoulders were tired. He came up the steps and he stopped and he looked at his wife sitting in the rocking chair in the long afternoon light with the basket of peas with a bit of silver at her temple, with her cornflower eyes lifted to him, and he stood for a moment and did not speak. She smiled at him. "What is it?" she said. He said, "I was just thinking, watching you from the lower fence, that you look the same as you did the first morning I made breakfast for you in the cabin." "The same exactly." She laughed. It was the laugh he loved best, low and surprised, the laugh that had first changed the air in the cabin all those years ago. "I do not," she said. "I have lines, Silas. My hair is going silver. I have borne 4 children. I do not look the same. You look exactly the same," he said. "To me." She set the basket of peas down. She held out her hand. He took it. He sat on the rail beside her. Do you remember she said the first time you said the words winter always ends? I do, he said. February 83. We had lost a heifer to wolves. You were standing at the window and you would not turn around. I have heard you say it 1,000 times since she said to Rhett when he broke his leg, to May when her first baby came in a snowstorm, to Annalise when little Edmund had the croup, to Hester when she lost Pearl 1,000 times. It has become the song of this house. He nodded. She said, I have never told you what I thought the very first time I heard you say it. What did you think? He said. I thought she said, here is a man who has decided to live. I did not know I was thinking it, but that was what I thought. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes in the May light were very bright. He said, you are the reason I decided to live, Della. She shook her head. She squeezed his hand. I am not, she said. You decided. I just gave you a place to do it. From inside the cabin, the small voice of Cordelia, the granddaughter, called out, Grandpa, Grandpa, Grandpa. He turned his head. The 2-year-old came toddling out of the cabin door with a wooden horse Bo had carved for her. She held it up. She marched directly to her grandfather, and she presented the horse to him with great seriousness. Fix, she said. Silas Thorne took the small wooden horse in his enormous hand. One of its legs had come loose. He examined it with the gravity of a man examining a broken plow. I will fix it, he said, after supper. Cordelia nodded once, satisfied, and toddled back inside the cabin where her mother caught her and lifted her into the air. Silas turned back to his wife. He said, I have one thing left to say. I have been waiting for a Sunday like this one to say it. What she said. I am not afraid of dying anymore, he said. I have not been for a long time, not because I want to. I do not want to. I want every Sunday I can have. But I am not afraid of it. When my time comes, Della, lay me in the rise back there with my mother and my father and my sister and Pearl, and lay yourself beside me when your own time comes, and that will be the end of the story. And the children will run on this place. And someday Cordelia, that one in there, will sit on this porch with her own husband and her own children, and she will tell them about the great-grandmother who came up the mountain in a blizzard and the great-grandfather who carried her in, and the story will go on without us. That is enough, Della. That is more than I ever thought I would have. She did not answer in words. She turned in the rocking chair. She put her forehead against his shoulder the way she had done the night beside the empty grave. He brought his arm around her. The May sun was warm on the porch boards. The smell of bread came out the open door. Down at the creek, the boys were shouting. Bo was playing the harmonica somewhere over by his cabin, a slow tune Della had heard 1,000 times and never tired of. The cattle were lowing in the lower pasture. The aspens along the creek were full-leafed and shimmering. The grave on the small rise behind the cabin, the one that had once been empty, was no longer empty in any sense at all. She remembered sometimes, even now, stepping off the stagecoach into nothing. She remembered the weight of the carpet bag and the cold of the air and the certainty that she was going to die. She remembered the lantern swinging. She remembered the voice, not today, little bird, not on my mountain. 26 years later, sitting on the porch he had built with his own hands, with her head on his shoulder, watching her granddaughter laugh inside the cabin, and her daughter-in-law shell peas in the kitchen, and her son and her grown sons-in-law working the lower fence in the long Montana light, she thought that was the day my life began. She did not say it aloud. She did not have to. He knew. That is the story of Cordelia Ashcroft, who came up the Bitterroot in a blizzard in December of 1882 with $7,400 of forged debt at her back and a stolen Derringer in her carpet bag, and who walked out of that cabin only once in October of 1937 at the age of 79, when her sons and her daughters and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren carried her up the small rise behind the homestead and laid her down beside the giant of a man who had 54 years earlier gone to one knee in the spring earth and asked her to marry him with his hat in his hand. He had gone ahead of her by 3 years. She had outlived him because she told her daughter Annalise the winter before her own death somebody had to keep the fire going. She is buried with her husband and his parents and his sister and his niece, and eventually with 2 of her own brothers-in-law on the small rise above the cabin in the Bitterroot Valley. The aspens shed their gold over the place every October. The pine that her father-in-law planted in 1849 still stands above the meadow where she was married. The cabin still stands. The school she built still teaches the children of the valley. And the line she gave her husband on a January night beside an empty grave, the line that became the song of the house, is still spoken in that family on hard days more than a century later by people who never knew her but who know that it came from her. Winter always ends. If this story warmed you tonight, Do me one last favor before you ride on. Hit the like button. Tell me down in the comments where you were listening from. Tell me if you would the name of someone you loved who taught you that winter always ends. I read every comment. I read them by my own fire. And I will see you next Sunday, friend, with another story from the long high country. Until then, ride safe. Keep your fire burning. Keep your heart open. And remember, on the hardest nights, that somewhere in this country, on a small rise above a Bitterroot Valley homestead, a woman who came up the mountain with nothing made a life that is still being lived. Good night.